Welcome to the podcast on sustainability research. I'm Markéta Svobodová and I'm happy to welcome here my today's guest, Frédéric Hache. Welcome, Frédéric. And firstly, I will say a few words or sentences about you before we go into the details about today's topic. So Frédéric Hache is a financial expert. He works for 12 years in investment banking, selling and structuring currency derivatives. After that, he was head of policy analysis at the NGO Finance Watch for 6 years, analyzing EU legislation linked to systematic risks and financial stability. He now heads the Belgian think tank Green Finance Observatory, lectures part-time in sustainable finance at Sciences Po Paris, works as a freelance expert on sustainable finance and environmental markets. Okay, and let's go to the questions I prepared for you. So could you please explain what sustainable finance is and how it relates to green finance?
Right. Sustainable finance, there's not one unique definition. There are several potential definitions, but in general, it's, as I understand, it's understood as financing activities that are sustainable. And the way this is understood today is financing activities linked to the Sustainable Development Goals developed by the UN. So it is about sustainability. It's about basically financing activities that are remain within the planetary boundaries. That's what is the goal. And sustainable finance can be understood also in different ways. There's the environmental component, of course, but there's also a social component, as in you should finance only activities that respect human rights, that respect minimum social labor rights, etc. And green finance, is often used interchangeably with it, but in theory, it's only the environmental component. Mm-hmm. But people use sustainable finance or green finance most of the time as they're the same.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And how should sustainable finance or also green finance work, in your opinion? How should it be?
Well, it should be aligned with science, right? It should follow what science tells us, which is, for example, in the case of climate change, it should be compatible with IPCC recommendations. In the case of biodiversity loss, it should follow what the IPBES or the IUCN tells us on what are the root causes of biodiversity destruction and what can we do, what should we do to stop the 6 mass extinction of species that is underway. So that's how it should work. So, for example, that means that it should not be based on an assumption of continued economic growth. And it should challenge our existing paradigm of maximizing GDP growth and competitiveness and treating the ecological crisis as an afterthought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, which is not really the case, how it works. And regarding investments, because it's big part of sustainable finance, investments made with the intention of generating a positive social and environmental impact alongside a financial return are known as social impact investments. So if someone wanted to invest in this way, to do it really practically, what would you recommend to ensure that they have the greatest possible impact to have it?
Right. So, I understand social impact investment as focused on the social aspect and not the environmental aspect. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about both, it's an interesting question. I don't have any recommendations to make except using your common sense, because basically sustainable finance or green finance as it is today, and there's many frameworks, etc. But I don't know any framework that is based on a degrowth assumption, that is not based on a continued economic growth assumption. So I don't know anything that is really generally green in terms of the offer of green funds, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to invest in a way that is sustainable, then you could invest, in companies that do useful activities. And we know, if you use your common sense, it's pretty easy to know. We know, for example, what the biggest things we need to do, right? If you want to stop tropical forest deforestation, curb emissions of greenhouses and curb water pollution, blah, 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 is change your diet, right? So eat less beef, for example. That would be the biggest thing we can do. So obviously you would not invest into anything, meat related or etc. But you can invest on anything that promotes, healthy food and more vegetarian diets. Likewise, when it comes to energy, we need to reduce our footprint. We need to promote renewable energy, but we also need to reduce our footprint. So anything related to curbing our individual footprint, such as home insulation, kind of makes sense, right? Same thing, public transport is good. We need public transport. We need walking, we need cycling, and we need public transport. That you can invest in. EV is more controversial. But so basically, once you understand what the scientists say are the root causes of the issue and what are the solutions, because we know the solutions, there's no shortage of solution, then you could invest into individual companies, etc. Of course, if you do that, you will not necessarily have an investment that is as diversified in terms of the scope of the number of companies you invest in, as if you would invest in a green fund. But in my opinion, it will be much greener. But that's a trade-off. I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying it's better. I'm saying this is more consistent. That would be more consistent with what science says, in my opinion.
And relatedly, investment funds that screen companies based on ESG criteria are called responsible investment funds.
I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, these green funds are based on, so far as I understand, on some industry voluntary frameworks, right? That are not tight enough. I mean, there's been a number of scandals, whether in green bonds issuance or sustainability bonds issuance. And the EU has put together a harmonized list of green economic activities, right? That is supposed to be the basis for future green bonds, issuance, etc. But even that list is arguably not aligned with what science says we need to do. So far, this tweaks at the margin, but I have yet to see anything that is really appropriate.
And why do you think it's so that even these EU lists do not cover what science says, that it's not really aligned?
It's just politics. I mean, politics is arm wrestling between different interests, right? So it's a result of political negotiations. And you have on one hand, people who say, all right, we are facing an emergency. Like, this is not tomorrow's problem. This is today's problem. And I would, need to remind you where we're headed, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what science says on that regard. And then you have private interest. You have, for example, private lobbies who of harmful activities who do not want things to change. You have governments with fossil fuel reserves who do not want to give up their reserves, etc. And so at the end of the day, it's the balance of political forces that leads to a certain result in terms of legislation.
And this happened also at COP30, right? That there were too many lobbies and too much focus on other things than it was planned originally. So maybe...
No, sorry, I was just going to say that what happens is nowadays, because it's very difficult to deny climate change, right, or to deny the issue. What lobbyists tend to do is to try to redirect public attention, public opinion towards false solution, such as creating new markets on pollution, nature, in order to buy some time, in order to protect the status quo for a few more years, as I understand it.
Yeah. And if we look into the details on biodiversity markets in the same focus, how do you see this? Because you have been watching closely COP30. Can you update us about what happened there regarding this topic?
Right. So, I mean, you have two types of COPs, right? You have the climate COPs and you have the biodiversity COPs. So the last biodiversity COP was last year in Cali. The COP30 was a climate COP that took place in Brazil this year. And even though it was a climate COP, there were indeed some developments or some meetings about biodiversity as well. And yes, I mean, biodiversity markets, in my opinion, are exactly an example of this false solution. Basically, we are told right? I mean, when it comes to the biodiversity crisis, okay, we are told that we need to create new markets on nature to address it. Why? Basically, the story is the main reason why we keep on destroying biodiversity is not a lack of political courage, is not a lack of legislation to, to restrict destruction. It is just a lack of money, is lack of funding to protect nature. And and we are told that this lack of money is estimated at $700 billion per year, and that it is too big for governments alone to close. And so we need to redirect private capital, and that the best way to reorient private capital is by creating a market that will trade permits to destroy biodiversity. All right. Now, if you look at this narrative, it is very debatable. I mean, it is very politically oriented. First of all, like I said, we know, and there's been, for example, there's been a great, we know the main causes of biodiversity loss, right? I mean, you had institutions who published a lot on that. So we know the first cause, for example, is deforestation for agricultural purposes and for urbanization, right? And we know that mostly it's basically deforestation to grow crops or raise cattle. And the crops are not used to feed us human in most cases. They're used to feed cattle. What that means is that if we want to address that, which is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, we could do that by changing our diet, right? And they even make an ideal diet recommendation, which surprisingly is not really that extreme. Essentially, the Eat the Lancet Commission says, okay, we should eat beef once a week, and chicken twice a week, and fish twice a week, plus 3 or 4 eggs. So like, wow, that sounds pretty feasible to me. And so if we do that, basically, we drastically curb deforestation, we curb greenhouse gas emission from cattle, and we curb water pollution from overuse of pesticides. So that we know we can do. And the second cause of biodiversity loss is overuse of resources, such as overfishing. Well, same thing, this can be addressed by the first solution. The third cause is climate change. And here also we know what we need to do. Basically, it's about changing our economic paradigm. It's about changing how fast and how we travel, and all this, and etc., and how we eat, etc. The fourth cause is invasive alien species, and the fifth cause is pollution, including plastic pollution, etc. So we know the causes and we know the solution, right? And the way to address that, and so for example, in the case of diets, what they recommend, they said, well, look, the way we can do that is by, for example, make it unhealthy food more expensive and healthy food cheaper, and by curbing advertising for unhealthy food, and by shifting existing subsidies from harmful activities to good practices, right? So we know that we can do that, and in fact, it would cost nothing. I mean, it does not require more money. Instead, we're told that no, it's an issue of funding. It's not an issue of doing all this. It's just we need more money. And we're told that the governments cannot find this money because it's too much money for them. But in fact, if you listen to the UN, they tell you that there is currently 1,700 billion of annual existing subsidies to harmful activities. What that means is that if we redirect a fraction of these subsidies, we close the funding gap. In other words, if governments stop subsidizing massively destructive activities, then they can totally close the funding gap without raising taxes, increasing deficits, etc. Or in other words, there is zero need to redirect private capital. There is public money can do it alone, no problem. So saying we need to redirect private capital is a political choice. Mm-hmm. But even if we wanted to redirect private capital and continue subsidizing massively destruction, right? Well, there would be much easier and cheaper ways to do it, such as, for example, Well, environmental legislation, because that would impact the future expected profits of the activities involved. And private capital would adjust to the new profit expectations. Or we could use tax subsidies, tax or favorable regulatory treatment. My point is that creating a whole new market, financial market infrastructure on a pseudo commodity does not make sense from an environmental perspective, does not make sense from an economic perspective. I understand it only in a political perspective as the way to distract from the real solutions. And in a way, because this false solution is compatible with, for example, EU's overarching political objective, which remains competitiveness. Sorry for this long, but so in this way, so that's this whole narrative. Now, how does that work? These biodiversity credits? Well, the principle is the same as carbon credits. So basically, let's imagine you're a company and you want to build a data center over a flamingo habitat in the south of France, right? Well, if we are under traditional environmental regulation, then the government will tell you, well, no, you need to do your data center somewhere else. If we have classic biodiversity offsetting, the government will tell you, okay, you can do your data center, but you need to recreate a flamingo habitat within 10 kilometers. Even though in reality, in most cases, we are unable to recreate fully all the ecosystemic functions destroyed. So it does not really compensate. And you have more extreme version. The third case is a more extreme version of biodiversity offsetting where you're told, okay, you can do your data center, but you need to compensate somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the world. And under some conditions, not necessarily by the same type of species or habitat that was destroyed. So that's how it works. So basically the idea is you're this company, you want to build your data center, you will pay a project developer to build a habitat for a species somewhere. The developer will then ask for a certification company to come and see and say, okay, you've done your project, you can issue these credits, and the project developer will sell the credits to the company who wants to compensate his destruction. That's how it works. And before the credits have been used, you can trade them on the financial market. You can buy them, you can sell them to bet on their future price. Yes. That's how it works.
So then the species will actually eliminate in this region or die because they can just regenerate another type of species somewhere else, which is like a problem because then we lose what we have in that area. So it's really problematic.
So it depends on the schemes. It can be the same or another type of species, but the problem is that this is not new. I mean, this has been existing for 40 years now. And the majority of the projects fail. And that's because our scientific knowledge is very incomplete. And that's also because the science of restoration is in its infancy. It's incredibly complicated. It takes a very long time. It costs a lot to restore. And there's a lot we don't know yet. And so that's why it is preferable to not destroy in the first place, rather than destroy and then try to recreate. No, and that's why there is a sort of scientific consensus nowadays to say that, well, actually offsetting does not offset. And nevertheless, the European Union is currently working to try and create such a market.
So it seems that it's similar to actually carbon offsetting because it's also not like, one-to-one, because it's just, before the tree really starts to generate what is needed, it's already calculated as it was doing it. So actually I see these two markets as problematic both. So can you maybe say a few words also about this carbon offsetting? What do you see as the main problem or main issue? What should we deal with?
Right. So you're right. It's very similar in the principle. The difference is that it's incredibly more complicated with biodiversity, because in the case of carbon, you have 6 main greenhouse gases that are more or less, we know the equivalence between the gases because you trade not 6 type of credits, you trade only one, right? which is called the ton of CO2 equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of biodiversity, you have millions of species that are linked together with a complex web of interdependencies. And so it is, in my opinion, simply not possible to simplify that into 4, 5, 6 types of credits, right? But the principle remains the same. And yes, carbon offsetting, it's been existing for a long time now. And essentially, there's been many scandals. There was a scandal in 23, I think, where they found that 94% of the credits certified by the biggest certification company corresponded to nothing. And that's because basically, yeah, there's many problems. One of the problems is that, for example, one of the activities that you can do to offset carbon is to plant some trees with the idea that the trees will sequester some CO2. But the problem is that the trees can die, can burn, etc. And on average, they will sequester CO2 for, say, I don't know, 30 years, more or less. Whereas the carbon that in the atmosphere that they're supposed to offset will probably stay 100 years or longer. So that's one problem. Another problem is that another type of activity is called avoided deforestation. So here you say, all right, I was planning on cutting this forest, but I will not cut it. So that will compensate for the destruction elsewhere. But it's very easy how can you verify that, that the person was intending to cut the forest? So what happened, and that was the main reason for the scandal, is that you can overestimate, grossly overinflate the baseline to say, yeah, we were planning on cutting all of that. But in fact, we were not really. So yeah, that's the... So carbon offsetting has been found to be extremely problematic.
And do you see there how it could be done differently? You mentioned regarding the biodiversity markets that there is the money and this could be done by just transferring the money which are now being used as subsidy to other.
Exactly. So it's not about doing it differently. It's about there is absolutely no need for this market. There is absolutely no need for this market. What is needed is to shift harmful subsidies and to put in place legislation that is more aligned with planetary boundaries. But of course, if you do that, you have to be ready to fight all the private lobbies for the harmful activities. And as that's one thing. And also, these harmful activities, right? They create GDP, they create jobs, etc. So that is not to say, doing the right thing would create jobs, right? For example, the biggest subsidies that we need to shift, well, some of the biggest subsidies, right, are the agricultural subsidy. So this is not about giving less subsidies to farmers. It's about subsidizing different practices, right? So for example, instead of subsidizing intensive farming with lots of pesticides, it's about paying farmers to do agroforestry and more organic farming, So they get the same amount of money at the end of the day, but you incentivize a different set of, the different thing. That's the solution.
And what can normal people do, besides just, going to elections and try to influence it through elections? What do you see as the effective, behavior of people, how to influence it?
Well, I certainly do not claim to have the solution, to be first start. But yes, voting is crucial. Protesting is also crucial. Striking is, going on strike is absolutely crucial. If you look at the history of social change, right, and environmental change, from the labor trade union movement, who got us the 8-hour workday, the 2 days weekend, the holidays, the paid holidays, to the U.S. civil rights movement, to the suffragette, to the U.S. and to the environmental movement, etc., etc. That's everyone can figure out what. But what is really interesting is that if you look at several recent surveys, they show that the vast majority of people, not only in rich countries but everywhere, already want change. But I think on average you have 80% of people who are willing to change the way they work and the way they live. But they tend to think that they're a minority. So if these people realize that they're the majority and start to unite, then I think we can shift change.
So bottom up.
Exactly.
Some have changed. Mm.
Yeah.
And what about negotiations or trying to persuade the United Nations or European Union? Does it make sense to try to, push these bodies somehow?
So the UN is not, I mean, you have countries behind the UN. So if you say pursue the UN, you mean persuading the countries who vote in the UN to change. I personally think, based on the history of social change, my understanding of the history of social change, that this change will come from the bottom up.
Mm.
So it doesn't mean you shouldn't try, right? You should try. But I think governments will change when they see that there's a critical mass of citizens who really want change. And then it becomes politically appealing to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they see the pressure.
And same with the EU. I mean, the EU is doing what the main member states want, right? One thing that is very interesting is really I find that there's a different. If you frame if you ask people, right, if the issue is framed in terms of party line, or if the issue is framed in terms of issue, you will find you get different results. For example, there was this climate citizen assembly in France. I don't know if you heard of that. And it was interesting. I found that really, really interesting because what it found is that you took random citizens, not experts, right, from all walks of life, and you gave them some time to actually get informed. And they came up with excellent recommendations that are really close to what experts say. So once people are aware and they have the time, and they think just in terms of, okay, what does the science say? What is going to happen? How will it impact my life, etc. And it's not blurred by what the media says or what your party spokesperson says. Then you find that majority of people won't change, as I understand it.
That's good news, actually. It's
Yeah.
good. Maybe before we end this podcast, you have authored and also co-authored several papers on green finance and also other topics. Maybe could you share with us the most surprising findings for you? What surprised you, and explain what you think would be or could be inspiring or impactful for general public who can now hear us, or organizations, our listeners? What could be the essence, let's say, of these papers?
So what I find, first of all, is the way to understand these new marketing schemes, like I said earlier, is through a political lens. I don't think they make any sense from an environmental or economic lens. And the only way you can understand why they're being promoted is political. I found that, and you have the same thing that is being replicated across different things. For example, we talked about, for carbon, we have this. So for climate change, we have these carbon markets. We're like, oh, look, we have this carbon market. It's offsetting, so no need to curb our emissions. I mean, not to the same extent. And now it's to biodiversity. The issue is lack of money, and we can do it with creating a market instead of putting new legislation that will curb destruction. And you have the same thing with river pollution, where they said that, you can compensate river pollution, etc. They have that in the UK. And now you have they're trying to create that for plastic pollution, saying instead of capping plastic production, they say, no, don't worry, you don't need to do that. Look, we will do a market on plastic credits, where you can compensate plastic. So it's the same thing all over again, always, always, always. And that's always the same people promoting that. It's the people who don't want things to change.
Wow, that's interesting. So thank you very much for this sharing. It's not so positive, but we can do some things ourselves. So
yes, it is not negative. I mean, the future is not written yet. I think we can absolutely do something.
We can start with ourselves, like with the little steps, and try to persuade people around us, and make some movement.
True, but I think that raising awareness and coordination, grassroots coordination, is really, really important. So yeah, speaking about it with people around you and going to protest, etc., etc.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the whole podcast, for your sharing. It was great speaking to you. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you and all the best. Bye-bye, and bye-bye, our listeners. Bye.
This podcast was brought to you by the volunteer group Respawn. Since 2015, we have been working towards influencing a positive change in the responsibility and sustainability of organizations, companies, public players, and individuals. Respawn. Turn the responsibility on.